Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British Rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Longsight, Joshua Long, and Ohio Trucker 1. You are the reason why this content remains in the land down under, and yes, today I am going to focus on a story that comes straight to us from Australia. I actually have quite a number of Australian followers, I've noticed. You guys are pretty vocal down there, and thank you, by the way. And since I'm kind of taking a break from talking about steam explosions and moving on to accidents involving famous locomotives, I thought I might talk about one of your famous locomotives. In fact, she is arguably the most famous steam locomotive in Australia, number 3801, a 462 38 class steam locomotive that was first constructed in 1943. 3801 is still in service to this day, running excursion trains all over Australia. She's notable as being the only preserved steam locomotive that has been able to visit all the mainland states and territories in Australia. But there was at least one time where she was indeed involved in a major and tragic accident. This is the story of the Cowan Rail Disaster. Before we press into the actual accident, let's talk about 3801 a little bit, since I feel like people outside of Australia may be a bit curious as to the history of this particular locomotive. Like I said, she was built in 1943 by Clyde Engineering, and she was the first of 30 of the 38 class locomotives built specifically to haul express trains. You'll notice she has some interesting streamlining going on, and when she was first built, there was little fanfare upon her arrival. See, it was 1943, smack dab in the middle of World War II. People had other priorities at the time. And actually, those that did notice took to calling her the Grey Nurse, as she was not nearly as colorful as she is now, being given an all-gray color scheme for wartime camouflage. She actually ran with several different color variations over the course of her career, but the most famous is definitely the bright green and yellow stripes she usually has. But she's been red and black, all green, and like I said, gray. And her career in mainline service lasted a pretty amazing amount of time. She went through some refurbishments on occasion due to boiler issues, but it's worth noting that she, as well as a lot of the others in the 38 class, were actually one of the main reasons why diesels took a long time to get a hold of the Australian lines. See, the diesels that they developed themselves, or even ones they got a hold of from outside the country, couldn't actually match the speed of the 38 class. They were too good in terms of speed performance. Their official top speed is listed as 70 miles per hour. Or 112 kilometers per hour, but I would say 3801 can probably go a little bit faster than that if you let her. In fact, in 1964, she set a record by traveling from Sydney to Newcastle in just 2 hours, 1 minute, and 51 seconds. This wasn't broken until 1988 by the XPT. However, she couldn't last forever, and even though she was being leased around to various heritage railway organizations, boiler trouble seems to follow her wherever she went, and by 1974, the Public Transport Commission actually barred all steam trains for the New South Wales main lines. Though an exception was made for 3801 because she was to star in an award-winning film called A Steam Train Passes. Throughout the 70s and 80s, 3801 saw a lot of use for excursion services. She was actually deeded out to the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum, and then eventually under the umbrella of 3801 Limited, now known as East Coast Heritage Rail. Like I said, she's a popular locomotive for Australian rail fans, and she actually took part in events with the Flying Scotsman. Yes, that Flying Scotsman, because the Flying Scotsman has made international trips in the past. But that's a very long story for another day. But as we've learned, no matter how amazing or beloved a steam locomotive may be, they're not immune to accidents. Things do happen. And on the 6th of May, 1990, what became known as the Cowan Rail Disaster occurred. It was 7:20 p.m., and 3801 was pulling a special passenger train with people returning from the Morpeth Jazz Festival. The accident occurred around 5 kilometers, or 3.1 miles, south of Brooklyn in New South Wales, very close to the Boronia No. 3 tunnel. This spot is known as Cowan Bank, and it's a 2.5%, or 1 in 40, grade, which, unless you're a Shay or a cog railway-based locomotive, is a very steep grade. As 301 passed southwards through the tunnel, her wheels started to slip. The driver applied sand to the rails to improve traction, which is a very typical reaction to this kind of situation. Many locomotives, even to this day, utilize sand to improve traction whenever they're suffering wheel slip. But the sand method isn't perfect, and it can lead to some issues, as it did on this day. Despite the sand application, 3801 came to a complete stop, which seemed bizarre at the time, as she should have been powerful enough to get up that grade. As this was all going on, another passenger train was actually on the line behind 3801's train. This one was a V-set, which is an EMU that was operated by NSW Trainlink. They were built between 1970 and 1989, and they're a little old school, all stainless steel construction. They're not bad by any means though, and they're actually still in service to this day. But this particular V-set, DIM 8060, was about to run into some trouble. Passengers on board 3801's train reported seeing fluctuating signal aspects between green and yellow. This is unusual, as signals shouldn't change back and forth that quickly during normal operation. At the same time, 8060 was actually halted at the northern entrance of Baronia No. 4 tunnel by a red stop signal, and had been for about 10 minutes. As 3801 continued to struggle with the hill, the signal that was holding up 8060 switched from red to green. The driver, assuming all was clear, proceeded to move the train forward. Less than a minute later, he looked on in horror as the rear end of 3801's train came into view around the tunnel. There was no time to react. VSET 8060 slammed into the rear carriage of 3801's train. The driver of 8060, Gordon Hill, was killed instantly, as well as another passenger who was riding in the cab. 4 passengers were also killed in 3801's train. The retired Vice Chancellor of the University of Sydney, John Manning Ward, his wife and daughter, as well as the wife of the university's registrar, bringing the total death toll to 6. At least 99 passengers were injured, 11 of those seriously. The last carriage of 3801's train was completely destroyed, and the force of the impact was enough to break the locomotive coupling and push 3801 12 meters forward. And though 3801 was largely unscathed, DIM 8060 was viewed as damaged beyond repair and scrapped. So what in the world caused this? Why did the signal change to green when the line obviously wasn't clear? Well, an inquiry followed the incident, as you might expect, and it was headed by NSW's state coroner, Derek Hand. The investigation believed that the sand placed on the rails by 3801 may have had something to do with the accident. Like any modern railway, the lines in that area utilize track circuits to automatically change the signals in various situations. Under normal circumstances, the circuits would have read that there was a train on the line where 3801 was, and keep the signal red so 8060 would stay where it was. But that's not what happened. Why? It's believed that the sand had actually insulated the train from the rails. Sand applied to rails to gain traction can be very useful, but it can also interfere with other mechanics involving the rail lines. In this case, the track circuits that were still being used were AC track circuits, which were considered a bit outdated by this point, but the railway had never bothered to invest in replacing them, as they did actually still work. It's just that a more modern style of track circuit would have been more sensitive and less prone to being inhibited by sand. On top of that, an investigation of 3801's train found that somebody had applied a handbrake on the third carriage. And this could explain why 3801 was struggling with the grade, as she should have had the power to deal with it just fine, but if one of her cars was braked, that could explain why she was having trouble dragging the thing up the hill. Another thing that was noted was that the signaling system was a 2-aspect color light. However, a 3-aspect color light may have provided the driver with a bit more warning regarding the situation. I would agree with this, as, let's be fair, even cars get a 3-aspect color light at pretty much every traffic stop in America. I'm pretty sure a lot of countries do it that way too. I would imagine you would want to do the same thing with trains, as they are a lot larger and heavier and more dangerous in the wrong hands. 3801 didn't receive a huge portion of the blame here, as putting sand in the rails wasn't something unique to her, but what was more unique was that she was not fitted with a sand removal system. Some trains have a method to get the sand off the rails after it passes through their wheels. Had 3801 had this installed, the sand wouldn't have stayed on the rails past her and onto the rest of the train, thereby allowing the track circuits, if they weren't going to detect her, at least detect the passenger carriages. Either way, it would have stopped the crash from happening. If all that wasn't bad enough, there was actually no mechanism for train-to-train or train-to-signalman communication at that time. something that is almost a necessity with any rail line these days. Had Gordon Hill, over on the V-set, been able to radio a signalman, or 3801, he may have asked where they were, and they'd been able to tell him, "Oh right, we're stopped, please do not plow into us." All this combined resulted in what's known as a wrong side failure. A wrong side failure is a failure condition in a piece of railway signaling equipment that results in an unsafe state. The signal was simply wrong, and NSW did not actually choose to upgrade the signaling system, at least not back then. Instead, they put an interim ban on all steam locomotives on their rail lines, which was lifted 9 months after the accident. However, 2 new permanent rules were that operators were required to use at least 1 state rail employee on each train, and operators were required to carry insurance of at least $10 million. The government agreed to underwrite any claims exceeding that amount. But what gets me is, I feel like that doesn't really solve the problem. It's pretty clear the issue lies in the AC track circuits, which needed to be upgraded. Had they been a more modern design, the accident probably wouldn't have happened. I would agree that 3801 may have needed a sand removal device installed. That might have solved it too, but still, you're using outdated circuits. You guys gotta fix that, or no? No, alright, we'll just move on. Alright, I don't know why I ask these questions anymore. All that said, 3801 is still in operation to this day, and is still a beloved icon of Australian rail lines. She actually returned to service just last year on the 13th of March 2021, following another overhaul, as well as getting some upgrades. And she actually isn't alone. She is not the sole survivor of the 38 class, sometimes called the C38 class actually. I don't know why there are multiple names for the same class, but there are. She's the only one that's currently operational. However, 3813 is still considered preserved, but is presently dismantled. 3820 is on static display, and 3830 actually used to run, but sadly had to be put into storage as she needed boiler repairs and there just wasn't enough money to do it at the time. Hopefully she'll be returned to the rails as well, and join 3801 as an icon of Australian steam technology. Till next time, this is Darkness, and a bid you all a fond farewell.